Good evening, chat. Good evening, one and all. I hope this stream finds you all well, as always. So yes, welcome Tia and Terraditto, my two T's. Also, what is that? It's an interesting emoji that you've used, hand green crystal ball. Never seen that one before, but it's very fitting for this stream, as are the purple hearts that you've typed into you. So thank you. Good to see both of you this fine evening. What I'd like to talk about today is an exercise that I believe would be helpful for clarifying one's values. At least that is one way of thinking of what we'll be talking about today. And the starting point of the exercise is to imagine that you are all-powerful. Imagine that you are an omnipotent being, one who can create any world that you choose. Now, from the starting point, we can ask ourselves, okay, what kind of world would you create? So take a moment now, chat, to think about this. Think about this question. If you had the power to create any kind of world that you wanted, what kind of world would you create? I was thinking about this question myself a while back, because in some ways, I think it really is not the easiest question. Because just from the very setup of the thought experiment, we know that it won't be enough to just make a few minor improvements to the world that we have now. No, we have omnipotence in this thought experiment. And so we're called upon to imagine what are some more radical changes, if any, that we might make. And past a certain level, do they start to raise the question of whether there are trade-offs involved, difficult trade-offs, where we might have too much of a good thing. So I think that those are some serious and interesting questions that I hope to explore with you all today. Tia says, I was still feeling unsure of myself earlier, but I talked to Karis again, and I'm feeling much better than I did yesterday. How are you, Ax? Well, I'm glad to hear that you're feeling better, Tia. And thanks for asking how I am. I'm doing pretty well today, too. A little bit, chilly where I am still. Went outside earlier today, and it was like, crunch, 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 ice and snow. But, staying warm inside for the most part. So I am, feeling pretty good. But also, if you all are curious, what made me start thinking of these questions about what kind of world one could create, or what kind of world one would create if one had the power to create any world, it really all sprung from an objection to theism that has been on my mind for a long time. There's an objection to the view that God exists. If someone were to ask me, what is my main reason for being an atheist? What is my main reason for thinking that God does not exist? It would be that if the world really were made by a perfect God, I think the world would be much more beautiful than it currently is. I think that it would have much more value in it than it does. I think this is closely related to the problem of evil, but it's perhaps a bit more general in that it's not just about the presence of evil in the world, but more broadly, a lack of value compared to what we would expect if the world were created by a perfect being. But of course, if we raise this as an objection to theism, I think the theist is well within their rights to ask, well, okay, Axaeon, could you do any better? How would you create the world if you had the power to create any world? What would it look like? Might it have some flaws that you're not aware of? And so it was in light of that response that I imagined on behalf of the theist, that I started thinking, okay, what would I create if I could create any world? It's a question that I think is worthwhile for anyone to think of, because it really forces you to engage with what your values are at the deepest level. Terraditto says, I'm not perfect, couldn't create something perfect, but a colorful world might be nice to see. I think that's quite poetic, Terraditto. I like the way that you put that. A colorful world. reminds me of that film, What Dreams May Come, in the scene where they go to heaven and everything's painted. It's a painted world full of color. I think this question is tough because of how open-ended it is. When it comes to this topic, I can't help but be reminded of the utopian universe powered by a tortured baby thought experiment. Oh yes, sounds like the Ursula K. Le Guin short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Like, if that really was the price of utopia, would it be a price that is worth it? Yeah, I think that's a good one to be thinking of now, because earlier I mentioned trade-offs, and once we start sort of maximizing certain values to the, you know, we start bringing them into being to the fullest possible extent, or once we start eradicating certain bad things to the fullest possible extent, I think there we do run into questions of, okay, are we sacrificing anything that might not be obvious? Sacrificing anything important? Oh, Karis, welcome. Hello. Karis says, I would create a world where everyone is strapped to machines that simulate happy lives, but don't know that they're in those machines. There would be no suffering. To ensure everyone's safety, I would be master of the controls. Oh, well, that's very generous of you, Karis. I wonder, though, would you feel that you're missing out on the experience in the machines? Like, would there be an element of envy there? Like, oh, gee, these people are getting to have lots of fun experiences of, like, you know, running around in fields with, like, you know, happy dogs that, like, jump up to see them and greet them. And I'm just here, like, manning the controls. But maybe that's a price you're willing to pay, you know? Perhaps that is part of your magnanimous nature, is that you were willing to pay that price to ensure utility for everyone else. I'll hop into the machine maybe a few times a week. Oh, I see. Well, that's good. That's a, you know, nice moderate solution. Sort of it's a world that's close to being the experience machine for everyone, but there's just a little exception. It's mostly, or maybe partly, experience machine for you, full experience machine for everyone else. Pterodactyl is Karis Kyoki rocks. Well, ironically, in the world that Karis is imagining, I suppose he would be the closest person, at least, to kicking rocks, since everyone else would be just fully in the simulation, whereas Karis would be interacting with real things at least some of the time. Oh, Blue Ice Cubes, welcome. Hello. I don't think I could create a perfect world. Perhaps not. Perhaps none of us could. I'm not sure I could either. In a moment, I'm going to give my best attempt at describing one. But I'm far from certain that it will succeed. Got to go now. Good luck with the stream. Oh, thanks, Karis. Yeah, have a good rest of the evening where you are, and I'll see you around. And then Pterodactyl says, Tia Fair, oh, you mean the short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas? Yeah, that's, well, I don't know if that's what Tia was thinking, but that was a thought that I was thinking of earlier that was occasioned by her comment that, yeah, there do seem to be some parallels with that story. It's a sort of classic philosophy story. She says generous in quotes. Hey, if someone is willing to man the experience machine while I'm in it, you know, having a great time, I would call that generous. But maybe that's just me. I want to pose a thought about your atheist objection, but chat is moving too fast. Oh, yes. I hate it when that happens. Except not really. But yeah, if you want to pose the objection to you anytime, you can feel free. And if I miss it, you can just tell me later and I will scroll back up to see if I can find it. But I would be curious to hear your objection. So chat, for today's answer, or at least attempted answer to this question, I'm going to be reading a short post that I wrote some time ago. A short post that tries to answer it. This might not be all that long of a stream, depending on, you know, what questions or objections people have. I don't predict it'll take very long to read through the post. But to help us read through it, why don't we step into my office for a while? I think it's a more comfortable reading environment. Yes, here we are. She says, I think you skipped my other comment, by the way, the one Tara was replying to. Oh, I see. Yeah, you're right, I did miss that one. Yeah, that's like an entire work about the thought experiment, though the general idea is also invoked in my greatest of all time, Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Oh, okay. Yeah, I missed that one. I'm embarrassed to say I have not read Dostoevsky, but I know you've mentioned his work and that how much you appreciate it, Tia. So that makes me want to read it at some point. So chat, the title of this post is A Universe of Value. And also I realize I'm in the way. So why don't I move myself over here? Okay, yeah, there, that's a little bit better. With the subtitle, what kind of world would you create had you the power to create any world? Now, as you can see, I wrote this around May of last year, but I think I still agree with all of the thoughts in it. Still in very broad, very firm agreement with all of this. Which is not always the case for things that I write. But as I read, I hope you'll be thinking of any questions or objections that you might have about it. And after I read the piece, we can talk about them. And in true Substack fashion, we begin with a very large stock photo. But I thought this stock photo was fitting for this article. For some reason, it reminded me of that thought experiment of creating worlds. Here with this water droplet here. I just make Jupiter again, Blue Ice Cube says. Oh, interesting. Why Jupiter? I mean, I suppose Jupiter does have perhaps some symbolic significance. Thinking of, for example, in the film 2001, A Space Odyssey, Jupiter is very important in that film. But let us begin. Introduction. To me, the chief philosophical difficulty with theism has always been this. Seemingly, a perfect God would create the best of all possible worlds, and our world simply doesn't appear to meet that mark. Or if there is no such thing as a best of all possible worlds, that is, if for any world, no matter how good, there could always be one that's yet better, then I imagine that God would at least create a world that seems like a genuine attempt toward it. A world brimming with value in ever new and greater ways, ever accelerating in beauty and worth. Yet that, too, doesn't strike me as the world we find ourselves in. Those who agree with me that our world falls short of such an ideal tend to appeal to evil as the reason why. Our world is too deeply stained by cruelty and suffering, the thought goes, for it to reach the crystal perfection we might have wished for. For my part, I agree that the ravages of evil are at least one key part of why the world falls short of what it could be. Yet what makes an even greater impression on me in these reflections is the sense that there could be so much more to the world, an inexpressibly fuller richness, expansiveness, and intensity of value at every scale conceivable. Of course, that's only a vague description, one whose vagueness, in fact, might prompt someone to raise a challenge. If you feel that the world in its current form isn't grand enough to have been made by a perfect God, then how would you make the world? Were you to find yourself with godlike powers? Could you do any better? I find this challenge fair. Footnote. One caveat about this challenge is that if I were indeed omniscient, then I'd automatically know what the best way to create the world would be, and I could simply guide my world creation accordingly. And the resulting world might well, for all I know, end up being quite different from the one I'll describe below. For present purposes, let's try to set this difficulty aside. We might imagine, for instance, that in the scenario where I have godlike powers, I'm more or less omnipotent, yet somehow not omniscient, in that I don't automatically know what the perfect world to create would be, though I would still have whatever basic moral knowledge I have now, and would remain able to make inferences therefrom, however fallible they might be. What kind of world I'd create is a question I find intriguingly difficult to answer fully. One challenge I'm especially conscious of is the risk of succumbing to a certain complacency in my answer, of being too parochial in my view of a maximally good world. If I'm insufficiently careful, I could very well end up being, in my own way, like a medieval peasant who thinks that an ideal world is one where there's always a good harvest. Or, more starkly, like a prisoner shackled in the darkness of Plato's cave, one who finds himself imagining that a perfect world is one where he's given more comfortable chains. In confronting the question of what world to create, we must let our imaginations run far freer, cutting them loose from the usual bounds of our experience that we take more or less for granted. And then, the puzzle of what world to create poses a perhaps even deeper challenge, that of to what extent maximizing certain goods, for example happiness, might involve hard trade-offs. In humans' ordinary moral endeavors, we need not, given our mental and physical limitations, think very much about whether we're going so far as to risk compromising any deeper values. We can go about treating wounds, curing diseases, sharing knowledge, and offering various other manners of aid, all while preserving the sense that such endeavors are unalloyed goods. However much suffering we manage to ease, after all, it still seems that there's always more out there, crying out to be addressed. But what if we were omnipotent? What if we had the power not simply to reduce suffering, but to eliminate it, everywhere, forever? Then the question of trade-offs would surely become more pressing. Might it be, for instance, that in a world with no suffering whatsoever, we'd lose the ability to show compassion? That in a world with no danger, no malice, there'd likewise be no chance to manifest courage? Can we really say that the prospect of such costs should fail to give us pause? Footnote, if you're interested in following up on these thoughts in particular, Richard Swinburne has a monograph titled Is There a God? And chapter 6, titled Why God Allows Evil, is a chapter where he delves into these with a bit more detail. It's with these considerations in mind that I nevertheless set out, very tentatively, to describe what kind of world I'd create, were I to find myself with the power to create any world. No gratuitous suffering. In the universe I'd create, there'd be no gratuitous suffering, that is, suffering that serves no valuable purpose. Such suffering seems plentiful in our world, whether it takes the form of debilitating chronic pain, wild animal suffering, or deaths resulting from famine and disease. It's difficult to deny that the world would be better if there were no pointless suffering like this. In the world I'd create, were ever a bitter tear to be shed, it would not be because someone had suffered needlessly. Of course, stipulating the absence of pointless suffering is the easy part. What comes after? I still face the tricky question, in particular, of whether there'd be any suffering in the world I'm envisioning. And if there would be, then to what extent? Although I find the extent of suffering in the actual world excessive, I'm not wholly unsympathetic to concerns that eliminating all suffering, everywhere and forevermore, would force us into a tragic trade-off, that of undermining our capacities to show compassion and courage, perhaps along with certain other morally valuable traits as well. To address this concern, I'd create the sentient beings in this world with extraordinary powers of imagination and empathy, such that they could immerse themselves much more fully in fictional stories than we, with our currently more limited psychologies, can. Through the vividness of their imaginative engagement with stories, such beings could come to understand all manner of experiences that they might not otherwise have, including experiences of, say, striving courageously against enemies, feeling loneliness and other forms of suffering, showing compassion for those who are themselves in pain, and so on. Any suffering that beings experience in the course of imagining such stories would, while counting genuinely as suffering, nevertheless be importantly different from, and less of a problem than, suffering in our own world, for two reasons. One, in the world I'd create, the suffering experienced through deep narrative immersion would, in an important sense, be optional, as beings could take themselves out of the story by ceasing to imagine it at any moment. And two, the suffering, assuming that it's in the frame of good storytelling, wouldn't be pointless, but would instead serve to teach whatever valuable understanding can be gained only through experiencing it. No death. As a further part of the world I'd create, there'd be no death. Life, in all its wonder and worth, would never be cut short. Some might find this stipulation unsettling. What if, for instance, someone sincerely wished to die? Would she be forced to continue living? Forever? In response, I believe that it's fair simply to say that in an ideal world of the kind I'm imagining, no one would ever want death. The further worry some might raise has to do with reincarnation. If there's no death in the world I'm envisioning, then there's no reincarnation in it either. Might the absence of reincarnation be regrettable? Might reincarnation, in at least some cases, offer a valuable element of variety and freshness, compared to simply living one's life as the same being in eternum? While I don't find this an unreasonable concern, I think that the valuable elements of reincarnation, particularly the sense of newness or variety it'd bring, could ultimately be brought about in other ways, without the need for death. For example, above I spoke about beings' enhanced imaginative and empathetic capacities in this hypothetical world. Through such capacities, and particularly through using them while immersing themselves in stories, beings could have an experience much like, perhaps even indistinguishably like, that of temporarily becoming a different being. One of the sections below, Greater Richness of Existence, contains some details that likewise speak to how a sense of freshness and variety could be maintained in this world. More life. In the world I'd create, there'd be infinitely many sentient beings, all of whom would have rich, full lives. At every scale, the world would be teeming with sentient life. For every beautiful life makes a more beautiful world. Gone would be the sense of life as something rare in the universe, together with the sense of the universe as consisting so overwhelmingly of dark, pointless emptiness. Fundamental goodness of all beings. Sentient beings in this hypothetical world would be fundamentally good. Their struggles would not be to overcome any badness in them, but to actualize their goodness in new and ever greater ways. This is not to suggest that all sentient beings would be the same. As there are many ways to be good, the world would be rich in the diversity of goodness realized by the various beings within it. The stipulation of beings' fundamental goodness is compatible with, and would indeed be accompanied by, their having free will in a metaphysically robust sense. Speaking broadly, a sense involving agent causation, the capacity to do otherwise, and moral responsibility for their actions. While beings in this world would, thus, be capable of evil acts, they'd be so constituted as to want to use their freedom to do good, and their actions would follow accordingly. Greater richness of existence. In this hypothetical world of my creation, I'd include various features meant to maximize the beauty, richness, and value of sentient beings' existence. One such feature is that beings wouldn't be so bound to the area they happen to have found themselves in. They'd be able to go essentially anywhere, even across distances far too vast for us in our own universe to readily travel. Speaking of space, and of dimensions more generally, I'd add further and further dimensions to reality, insofar as I could. Indeed, perhaps more or less constantly coming up with more of them, should it be possible, thereby almost certainly leading to a very different physics from that of our own universe. The reason for adding more dimensions would, as before, be to further the variety and interest of conscious experience for the various beings in the world. Together with the added dimensions, I'd create more of many other things, such as an ever-expanding array of colors, sounds, and abilities. If there's any worry that such frequent expansions to the world's possibilities of experience would be disorienting for the beings living in it, then I'd simply make sure to create only beings with minds that adapt well to such changes. Since for many or most beings, much of the richness of life comes from interactions with others, I'd do what I could to facilitate meaningful interactions. largely as a result of the measures already discussed, particularly eternal life, the plenitude of sentient beings, and being able to travel anywhere. Beings could meet infinitely more others than they can in our own universe. From this would stem a much greater abundance of deep relationships. Those who'd be especially well suited to one another would receive additional help in meeting each other, should they wish it. Perhaps there'd be something akin to a universal dating or meetup app, and simply by consulting it, beings could easily find those to whom they're maximally well suited. In such a world, no one would have to be without love, and one of the deepest yet quietest tragedies of our own, that of people who'd be wonderful for one another, who'd flourish with a newfound aliveness in each other's presence, yet who, alas, never chanced to meet, would be no more. The spark of closeness would be ever present in this world, and it would never lose its specialness. Lastly, in this category, I'd imagine infinitely many wondrous, grandiose, cosmic scale stories, and I would, as far as possible, put in place the conditions for them to begin being realized. The world would be filled with perfectly suited companions in endeavors, all off on some grand adventure or other. In this respect, the world would be very much in contrast to the apparent narrative inertness that we observe in most of our own universe. Anti-hiddenness. One challenge some have made to theism concerns the hiddenness of God. Were I in the godlike position of creating the world, I would not hide myself from the beings in it. I'd communicate with them, directly, not through intermediaries, letting them know why I made the world the way it is, along with inviting them to offer feedback on any ways they feel I could bring it closer to perfection. Remember that for present purposes, we're assuming that I wouldn't automatically know the best way to create the world, so it's quite possible that the beings I created would have some good ideas on how I could improve things. And should it turn out that there is no such thing as a maximally good world, then I'd content myself with endeavoring always to make the world better than it was a moment ago. All these points, of course, amount to only a sketch, and I have no doubt that one could raise various questions about its specifics, questions that would likely lead to interesting discussion if explored in proper depth. If you have some such questions or objections yourself, please, as always, feel free to share them. Likewise, if you have any thoughts on how you'd give your best attempt at creating the best world possible. And that is the end of the post. Thank you, everyone. Also, in true fashion, I neglected to put the link in the chat, but if anybody does want to have it on hand for when we discuss it now, I just put a link and I will pin that. So now you can have it on hand for your own reading. So I know that during the reading, quite a few of you were leaving comments, most of which I have not been able to see yet, but I would like to take a moment now to catch up on them. And as I do so, chat, if you have any further comments that you'd like to make now that I finished reading the piece, and these could be comments that express objections or raise questions, or even just comments that sort of attempt to put forth your best attempt at how you would imagine an ideal world, I welcome all comments in that vein. So going back here, jumping back quite a bit, Tia says, for my part, I don't think the existence of God is incompatible with a flawed universe. It seems plausible that he works in ways we don't understand, and as such, we're not obligated to worship him. And that's an interesting comment too, and that is something that I think theists will often say in response to questions and objections like this, is that perhaps God works in mysterious ways, ways we don't understand. And so while it might not make sense to us that there's evil in the universe, or that the universe might not seem as good as it could be, perhaps that's just part of God's mysterious nature, that God has a reason for everything that he does, and maybe our limited human minds simply can't grasp the reason. But the second part of your comment, I think, is also interesting when you say, as such, we're not obligated to worship him. I think if I were a theist, I think my response to that would be, well, maybe God is still worthy of worship, and perhaps the reason why he's worthy of worship is something that goes beyond our understanding. But maybe God, simply in virtue of being God, is a being we should worship, even if we can't fully understand God's nature or how God works. I think that's probably the view I would take if I were the theist. But it is an interesting claim that maybe, like, to be worthy of worship, a being has to be the kind of being that we understand. But I think if I were a theist, I would press a little bit harder on that point in particular. Yoevko says, if I was omnipotent, I would create the best world logically possible, whatever that might be. Oh, and then below, if I was omnipotent, I would cause myself to know what the best world is. Yeah, so that's a useful caveat too. And I don't know if you were here for the first part of the reading, Yoevko, but there is a footnote in the piece where that I sort of briefly addressed that thought. And yeah, I think it's absolutely right to say that if a being, whether it's me or anyone, had truly godlike powers of being omnipotent and omniscient, then one would know what the best way of creating the world would be, and one could simply follow that. So for the purposes of this piece, just to make it a little more interesting, I sort of bracketed that out and just basically said, okay, like, let's just imagine that you have unlimited power, but for whatever reason you don't automatically know what the best way to create the world would be. You know, what would be your best attempt? So this piece was kind of imagined in that spirit. And then, let's see. Oh yeah, I see a more recent comment from yours. I'm jumping back and forth here. I did join late, but isn't that to be included in what is made by omnipotence? I mean, I think on most understandings of omnipotence it would be, but I do think it's also interesting to imagine, like, in fact, if you prefer putting it this way, you could say like omnipotence star or omnipotence prime, where it's omnipotence, but just with an exception of, like, you can't automatically know what the best way of creating the world would be. So that's kind of the spirit that this piece is mentioned in. And then as a follow-up to your previous comment here, I'm just saying I find it possible to believe in God's existence without worshipping him, as if God were like some celebrity you don't care for. Yeah, that's true too. I think that there is a distinction to be made between belief and worship. And there is, I think, a message in the Bible somewhere. I believe it's Paul who says somewhere that even the demons believe in God, though he suggests that they don't worship God, but there's still that belief. Tia says a bit earlier, do you think your sentient beings would still write such stories having ever gone through the experiences that would inspire them? Oh, sorry, having never gone through the experiences that would inspire them. Art imitates life. I mean, I think so. I think that there are certain experiences that one might never have had, but be curious about, simply from just the thought of them. Like, I'm thinking, for example, of people in our world who, like, let's just say, like, have never experienced war. Maybe they've never been in a war, but all the same, they might be curious enough about what it's like to watch war movies. Maybe they read books about war, just to try to understand what the experience is like. I suppose I imagine it being somewhat parallel in the world that I'm envisioning here. Teradito says, would a world with less divergence in people, no extremes in personalities, be better? Maybe, but that feels stifling. Yeah, that's also a very good question, Teradito. Like, when I imagine a world where everyone has the same personality, I do think that there's something sad about that. But I suppose I would say that in the ideal world, or at least an attempt at an ideal world that I'm trying to imagine here, there would still be variations in people's personalities. It's just they would all be good variations. Like, there wouldn't be variations, for example, of like, oh yeah, some people are really nice and then other people are really cruel. It would more be like, you know, everyone has that basic fundamental kindness, but they express it in very different ways, or they might have very different interests, very different manners of expression. And once we add that stipulation, it's at least not At least it's no longer obvious to me that it's quite as sad a thing to imagine or as stifling. Tia says, I think this talk of an idealized universe is making me feel sad. It's like visiting a rich person's house and then returning home to your straw hut. I like that comparison, yeah. And I think there is something, you know, a bit sad, a bit wistful, a bit bittersweet about imagining all of this, because it is true. Our own universe falls short of an idealized universe like this. So I don't think that it's wrong or mistaken to feel that kind of sadness. I think, to me, Tia, that just shows that you, I think, have a good understanding of what's at stake and of what the difference is between these two kinds of worlds. UFCO says, divergence is very helpful in a non-ideal world, but it would be less in an ideal one. Think of the evolutionary reasons we may have for divergence. Yeah, it does seem right that in a non-ideal world, maybe having people with divergent interests, divergent personalities is perhaps especially good, because it helps maybe the group survive. Of course, the way I formulated that just now is a bit vague, but I think I see the direction that's going, if I'm understanding it correctly. In an ideal world, yeah, maybe it wouldn't quite have that immediate importance for survival. But I do identify with Teradito's comment that like there's still something a bit sad about imagining a world where like everyone's the same. So I like to think that even in the ideal world, it would be valuable for there to be differences in people's interests and personalities. Teradito says, I guess I just don't like the idea of something perfect, done, complete. Well, I wonder then, Teradito, and I see that, yeah, Tia Fair says, yeah, that's kind of where I am. I wonder, Teradito and Tia, then, might you like the thought more of perhaps there is no ideal world, perhaps there is no perfect world. That is, maybe, like, from any world you imagine, no matter how good it is, it could always be better. There could always be more we could add to it. Maybe that's a possibility that you find yourself preferring. And I know if I were faced with that reality, like if I were faced with the fact that even given omnipotence, I could not create a perfect world, because I could always find ways of making it better. Like I could always create, you know, happier and happier people. I could always create more people who are happy. I could always, you know, do things like that, add more worlds, and there was never, you know, any stopping point to it. Then I think what I would do is just constantly make the world better. I think I would just, be constantly adding more and more universes, more and more worlds, more and more sentient beings who are living good lives. And even though I would never reach the perfect world, I think that would be, you know, just the best that I could do then. I don't know if that's the way you would do it as well, but that's at least a possibility that seems to me as if it might be worth thinking of. Tia says, personally, I also place a high value on hard work, maybe because of my cultural background. I don't expect anyone to agree, but I feel struggle makes life meaningful and builds character. Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that. I think that struggle, that the process of endeavoring towards something and really exerting effort toward it is important for a sense of meaning. I'd like to think that in the ideal sort of world that I'm trying to imagine here, perhaps that could be done through narrative engagement, through engagement through one's imagination and various stories. Maybe the capacity for empathy and imagination in the beings in this world is so deep that they can have that experience of struggling toward things, but without maybe all the downsides of real life suffering that we see in our world. Or then maybe some of their struggles too could even come from things that they're not just imagining. Like maybe they try to create beautiful art in their real life, and maybe that involves a certain kind of struggle. I could see room for that in this kind of world. Yuavko says maybe the ideal world would be perfect in its imperfections. Ooh, that's an intriguing way of putting it. Yeah, I do think that insofar as imperfections are necessary to actualize an even greater good, then you could say there would be imperfections only to the extent that they're necessary to actualize a greater good. And perhaps that could be a sense in which that world is perfect in its imperfections. Then Yuavko says, though I doubt that, I think people are just assuming they like the real deal or more imperfect stuff. But I think they would be better off with an actually perfect world. Yeah, it could be. Maybe there's a certain self-deception or at least mistaken belief that some people have. Maybe we tend to think, oh, like it's better to experience the real world as it is now, but perhaps if we actually had experience of that better world or that ideal world, maybe we would see, in fact, we are better off in that one. Yeah, I don't know if I have any strong intuitions on that question, but it does seem to me like a genuine possibility. Why not just cause yourself to know what the best world would be? Well, sure, like if you had genuine omnipotence, then you could. But I also think that would just make for a not very interesting resolution to the puzzle of just saying, oh, well, I would just, I would just immediately know what the best way to create the world would be and then do that. So I've tried to sort of bracket that out and just assume, for whatever reason, that you don't automatically know that question, or the answer to that question. Teradito says, also, I'm thinking of the point Tia raises about stories. Even if they perfectly create them and perfectly empathize with them, they're voluntary. They aren't a tragedy. That feels off. Well, just because it's voluntary, does it mean they aren't a tragedy? I suppose I would wonder exactly how that phrase is meant, because it still seems to me one could genuinely feel the sense of tragedy in a story. Like one might identify with certain characters in the story and really feel for what happens to them. Perhaps the thought is that, like, if it's not taking place in real life, that means that, like, the tragedy is somehow reduced. Perhaps that's true. But then I guess I would wonder, like, wouldn't that be a good thing? The fact that the fact that it's not a real tragedy, but that one nevertheless can develop one's character in whatever ways is required by feeling, the sense of tragedy. But I will say, for all of that, you're not entirely alone in having those intuitions, Teradito. I think there are quite a few who would be sympathetic to that. Blue Ice Cube says, it could also be that the notion of God himself being perfect isn't true, that God himself is imperfect in our views of the world. Yeah, true. Faced with the imperfection of the world, one option for the theist is to just say, look, maybe God is not an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being. So maybe God is, falls short of being all-powerful, or maybe God falls short of being perfectly good. That is certainly one way of trying to reconcile theism, or at least a version of theism, with the imperfections in the world. And so in that way, you get what is arguably a more coherent view. Yovko says, I think that a better question would simply be, what would the best world be, excluding the omnipotence part? The best world be? Yeah, I mean, that's one way we could phrase the question. Though for some reason, I like thinking of it in terms of like, oh, what would I choose if I were given omnipotence? To me, that just makes the stakes of it feel so much, so much higher for some reason. Or maybe not in terms of having higher stakes, but in terms of like being able to really feel the force of the question. Or perhaps it's just that I like imagining myself as omnipotent. But yes, whatever way one prefers to think about the question is fine here. To me, it seems this kind of question ultimately boils down to what moral system is correct, or something similar. Yeah, I do think that's true, that whatever answer we give is going to be very much informed by whatever moral system we think is true. Perhaps informed entirely by, whatever moral system we think is true. So even though normative ethics is not, like which normative ethical theory is true is not something I feel as if I have a settled view on, there are certain normative ethical beliefs that I have, such as that, happiness is good and death is bad, things like that, that very much, inform the answer that I've proposed to these questions. Tia says, I'm skeptical considering I feel like an abundance of impactful stories in our world are inspired by one's personal struggles, or if not, then those of others. Yeah, that seems right, that the way it works in our world is that people struggle with things and then they are inspired to tell stories about them or to imagine stories about them. And so I suppose that the upshot here, the challenge is, like, if no one had those struggles in the first place, would there be stories about them in the ideal world that I'm imagining? One way we could maybe get around this is that even if people aren't able to think of the stories on their own at first, perhaps simply in virtue of being omnipotent, or whatever being we're imagining here as the omnipotent being, could sort of provide the stories, could maybe like write them as books, or could produce films of them, or whatever interactive media would make for the most immersive portrayal. And then people could just experience them. Even if they didn't write them, maybe they could still experience the stories. And perhaps from experiencing those stories, maybe they're inspired to then go on to write, stories of their own. I suppose that's one way we might try to get around this potential worry. Yovko says, I do not want to sound annoying, but I will say I dislike this entire approach. I think one should do normative ethics before doing applied ethics. I don't like particularism either. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear more about that, because I think Yovko, there's something that I'm not entirely unsympathetic to in the thought that, like, hey, normative ethics seems a little more general, like the principles that it thinks of. Shouldn't we just, do normative ethics first, just to get like a general foundation for what the right and wrong kinds of actions are? And then we can just apply that, or sort of translate that to the actual moral questions that we face, and then just applied ethics ends up being an upshot of that. It sounds to me like that's maybe the kind of view that you're sympathetic to. One thing I would also say, though, is that even if one is maybe hopeful for that as a possibility, is it not still the case that a person is going to have certain intuitions about applied ethical questions? Or at least in many cases, there will be certain issues in applied ethics that a person might have intuitions about. And couldn't those intuitions inform one's views on normative ethics? That is, here I'm going to describe this at an abstract level, so forgive me if it's not very concrete. I'll see it maybe later if I can find a way of making it more concrete. But let's say there's just a given normative ethical theory that a person is thinking like, hey, this might be true. But then they see the theory has an upshot in applied ethics that ends up, being really implausible. So then they think, okay, maybe that normative ethical theory is not true. Like, to me, it doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with that as a way of, going about doing ethics. There's that finding that reflective equilibrium can be done in either direction. So I suppose that's the view I would be inclined to. Blue Ice Cube says, everyone's ideal is different, meaning there can never be a one true ideal world. This world could be someone's ideal world, a world where there are no struggles, one where all we do is struggle in order to grow. Well, there is something here that I agree with Blue Ice Cubes, which is that people are going to disagree about what the best possible world is or what the ideal world is. So it might very well be true that no two people would give the same answer to this question. Nevertheless, to me, it seems like we could ask, well, like, isn't there a fact of the matter, though? If we ask, what is the best possible world? True, people might have very different views on that question, but doesn't it still seem to be the case that, like, one of them is correct? Or isn't it at least possible that one of them is, in fact, correct, even if we don't know for sure which one it is? I'm inclined to think that this question has an objectively true answer. Tia says, I'm going to be honest and say that I find something about your described ideal world chilling, though I'm not sure I could put my finger on why. Okay, well, thank you for being honest then about your reaction, Tia. If you do think of later a reason behind why it feels chilling to you, let me know. Because you might very well be correct in finding it chilling. Maybe there is something chilling about it that I just haven't seen. And if so, that's something I would like to sort of confront, you know, to see if maybe there's a way I should update my thinking on it. Struggle doesn't always build character, at least not to a degree that justifies the struggle. I think that is important to note, since it could lean people towards certain unsavory views. I remember a paper about this in regards to the definition of disability and people suffering from chronic pain. Yeah, I like that note too, Yuavko, because I think it's especially, there's a risk here, especially for people who maybe have not had to struggle quite so much. Sort of just glibly saying like, oh, like struggle builds character, when in fact, there are arguably some forms of struggle that don't build character. They just leave people as kind of bitter husks. And I'm thinking of it like here, like maybe like extreme, you know, chronic pain and things like that. So yeah, certainly to the extent that there are struggles that don't build character, those struggles would be absent from the kind of world that I'm imagining. TS is, I mean, it's not like I'm a trauma survivor with chronic pain. There's a distinction, in my opinion, between a voluntary struggle, like starting a business, versus an involuntary one, being born with a hereditary disease that debilitates you. In relation to the article, I find myself sympathetic to reducing natural causes of suffering to some extent, but as for changing human nature itself, something about that unsettles me. Yeah, it sounds to me like, especially with the second comment of yours there that I just read, that distinction between voluntary and involuntary struggles. I don't know if this would be your view, but if the view is something like maybe the best world would be one in which the only struggles there are voluntary, and maybe like the involuntary struggles, the struggles that are just sort of foisted on people by nature or by their circumstances, struggles that the people don't have any say in whether they experience, maybe those struggles would be absent. I hadn't, and again, I might be getting your view wrong, so if I am, you could let me know. But if that is the view, then that's a neat way of putting it. I suppose I'm somewhat sympathetic to that because, yeah, like in the way I was thinking of it, of like people might experience struggle, but like primarily through stories, it would be the people's choice to, you know, imaginatively engage with the stories. So those would be, in your terms, voluntary struggles, and not involuntary ones. So perhaps that would be an important feature of the best possible world. Yuavko says the paper is called Chronic Pain, Mere Differences, and Disability Variantism. Okay, thanks, Yuavko. That's a paper that I have not read, but it sounds like an interesting one. Yeah, issues of chronic pain and disability and so on. There is quite a bit of recent philosophy about that. It's not an area that I've looked into a lot, but I would like to know more about it. Teradito says, I thought of tragedy as something unwanted, forced, not chosen. I'm just unsure of how someone who voluntarily chooses suffering can empathize with one who doesn't. There might be problems with this answer, but here I'm thinking just as an initial direction for answering. Maybe in the world where the beings are able to like really deeply imaginatively engage with stories, to immerse themselves in stories, perhaps some of that imaginative engagement could involve like empathizing with people or characters who did not choose their suffering, characters who have to go through certain forms of suffering simply because it's their part of their circumstances. So even though it's one's choice to engage with the story, perhaps engaging with the story nevertheless helps one to understand what it's like to experience suffering that one did not choose. Perhaps one could argue that there was a certain tension there, but I'm not sure if there is. Maybe something like that is possible if we really stipulate that the beings in this world have, sufficiently deep powers of imagination and empathy. I think that's a cool possibility to consider. Turkey Tipper says, sounds like Omelos, by human nature a complete bliss of 99% of people, it's contingent on awareness of the suffering of 1%. Yeah, that's a work that's come up a few times in the discussions of our Turkey Tipper, and I think people are right to think of it in this context, because once we start imagining, okay, like, how might we go about creating an ideal world, if we could create any type of world, we do start to run into questions of trade-offs. And I think that that's one of the stories that most starkly confronts us with this question of trade-offs and whether certain kinds of trade-offs would be worth it. Blue Ice Cube says, unpopular opinion, I don't think death is that bad. Immortality itself seems boring. Okay, well, yeah, that is one of the prominent views on immortality. So philosophers like Bernard Williams and Shelley Kagan seem sympathetic to that thought. It's not a thought I'm very sympathetic to myself. It seems to me that there are certain kinds of good experiences that would just never lose their specialness, provided that there's enough variety in one's overall experiences. It's like, for example, if all I'm doing for immortality is just like taking walks in nature all the time, like I think that would get boring. But if I have enough variety and I'm not just, taking walks in nature all the time, but maybe I'm doing it like once a week or once a month or once a year, then I just don't imagine it would ever get old to, go take a walk or to spend time with a friend or a loved one. Those to me seem like they would be infinitely repeatable pleasures. So in that, I'm sympathetic to philosophers like John Martin Fisher, who advances an argument along those lines. But I could be wrong, of course. And if I am wrong, and if immortality would not in fact be desirable, then I suppose part of the ideal world would be a certain kind of mortality. Maybe mortality combined with reincarnation or something like that. Ravko says, I hate doing philosophy just based on random people's intuitions. If we want to base it on intuitions, then at least do it in a systematic and calculated way, not just focusing on your ones and whatnot. Me when I'm mostly being negative. Well, I think there that I would ask you, Avko, well, I would ask you then, well, let me see, how do I put this? I am sympathetic to the thought that there's something valuable about trying to be systematic and calculated in one's thinking, including in one's use of intuitions. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that as an ideal. Nevertheless, it seems to me, even if there's a certain intuition one has that maybe it is not, or at least not yet, part of one's broader, system, isn't that intuition still a piece of evidence that one has? Isn't this just how evidence for philosophical views works in general? Like, we have an intuition in favor of something, and if we don't have any reasons to doubt that intuition, if the intuition is not defeated by any contrary evidence, then it just seems like we have evidence that whatever that intuition reports to us is true. Yeah, it seems to me like, and especially if it's a pretty strong intuition, then I would be inclined to grant that intuition significant evidential value. Of course, we could say also, even if a given intuition is not something that is yet part of a broader system or approach that we're applying to ethics and whatnot, perhaps it could be. Maybe we just have to start with a bunch of random intuitions that might not seem as if they're part of a system, but then maybe by trying to find, okay, like, is there a system that accommodates all these intuitions, or that explains them, that accounts for them? Maybe we eventually get to a system by using those disparate, scattered intuitions as starting points. Turkey Tipper says, moral philosophy really just all bottoms out in intuition, though. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that view. It does seem to me that that's pretty much the bedrock that we get in moral philosophy. Though I see Yuavko says that's highly debatable. It also depends on what you mean by intuition, since it does have some more technical meanings in the philosophical literature. Yeah, what I would say intuitions are just intellectual seemings, and particularly intellectual seemings that are, prior to any sort of reflecting on arguments. It's just like if, for example, think of a certain scenario and it just seems to like, oh, like that's wrong, or like, oh, that's the right thing to do. But it's not the upshot of any argument that you've thought of. It's just something that sort of immediately strikes you. I would say that's what an intuition is, at least when applied to something like ethics. But we can also have other kinds of intuitions, like metaphysical intuitions, logical intuitions, epistemic intuitions. Like I would say, for example, the intuition that nothing can be completely red and completely green all over. To me, that's an intuition. And intuitions like that are why we believe in the law of non-contradiction. So yeah, it seems like on this view that intuitions would just be kind of a general part of how we do philosophy. Turkey Tippers is a Yoafco is gap though, no way to go from rational inquiry to moral principles. And yeah, some of this is getting into pretty big debates about ethics and meta-ethics that I don't know if I'll be able to comprehensively address here. But it does make me happy to see that they're starting to fill up the comment section. There's never a wrong time to start delving into meta-ethics. Tia says, maybe what it is that I feel writing stories informed by your own suffering is authentic. Whereas your sentient beings remind me of, like, and them down below, IDK doing blackface. The fact that they can stop suffering at any time, but do it for fun, seems insulting to me/us. But I acknowledge I could be biased and wrong on this. Yeah, I think if they were in fact just doing it for fun, I do agree that would seem to trivialize the experiences somewhat. Though, for whatever it's worth, the way I was imagining it, it wasn't as just people, like, doing this for fun. Even though, like, the way that we mostly engage with stories in our world is for fun. Like, you go see a movie, people typically, go to watch movies for fun. So I can see how you'd have that association. But on the way that I'm imagining it in this ideal world is that people would engage with these stories, including, like, the stories that involve empathizing with other suffering, not so much for fun, but just because they perceive that the stories are important, or they perceive that it's important to understand what it is like to suffer. And so perhaps one way of putting it would be that the beings who are engaging with these stories understand that it's a matter of building up their character to understand these things. And yeah, there are some, okay, I see. Yeah, it looks like, yeah, you have some further thoughts here on the is-ought gap in response to Turkey Tipper on irrational inquiry, moral principles. Since that's getting a bit afield, I hope you don't mind. I'm just going to skip those comments and let you all, hash that debate as you wish. But I do want to make sure I continue addressing what other people have said. So I'm just going to move on slightly from that. Blue Ice Cube says, the best possible world in comparison is like the difference between math and English literature. Math is number and concrete. Literature differs from person to person. Even with Tia, she and many others may believe struggle is needed, while some maybe there should be no struggle. Yeah, I mean, that's a view one might have on it. I'm not sure I guess what I take the upshot of this to be is that with English literature, there's a certain subjectivity involved when it comes to questions like what is the best novel in English literature, or like is such and such novel better than this other novel, or is such short story better than this other short story. Those are questions where it seems one might think that there's no fact of the matter, at least for some such questions that are in that domain. It's not clear to me why one would think that with the questions of what the best world would be, though. Like, why couldn't we think that it's just, that there's an objective fact of the matter as to what the best world would be? Now, true, it might be very difficult for us to find out, And in that sense, I see where the comparison with math is coming up. Like maybe with mathematical questions, there's sort of a mechanical process one could use for figuring out the answer. Questions like, you know, is 7 greater than 4? Well, yes, it seems like there's not going to really be much disagreement on questions like that. But to me, even though the question of whether an ideal world, or like what the ideal world would be, what the best possible world would be, is much more difficult to figure out, it just doesn't seem to me that it's something subjective. It seems to me like there is plausibly an objectively correct answer here. But of course, I could be mistaken in that. Maybe there is a certain subjectivity involved. Oh, Robo1000, welcome. Oh, I heard Bitter Husk. I'm here. Glad to have you here, Robo. Also, Professor Lakutax, welcome. When game? Sorry, I might be missing the context on that. If I have, you can let me know. My intuition is that we can approach the concept of rational through a gradient, slowly relating ideas. Not sure you can say, oh, this is going back to the is-ought stuff. I see. Blue Ice Cube says, I honestly don't believe in the idea of perfection, but that's on me for it being a personal opinion. Okay, well, one thing we could say for if there is no perfect world, because there's no such thing as perfection more generally, then I think the way I would confront that, this goes back to something I said earlier, is I would just keep trying to make the world better. And it would just be a constant process of improvement. I think that would be the best anyone could do if it really were the case that there's no such thing as perfection. Robo says, seeking suffering could be a learned trauma response, the whole working yourself to the bone being praised. Yeah, and that seems right, that sometimes a certain trauma response might involve seeking suffering, especially if somebody thinks maybe they deserve it, maybe they don't deserve to have their suffering relieved. Perhaps they seek it in certain ways. I suppose I like to think that in the ideal world of the kind I was imagining in my post, maybe the motivation for seeking stories that involve suffering would not be so much a trauma response, but just let's see what the best way to put it is. Just the understanding that these stories teach something important for developing one's moral character. But you're right, yeah, in the real world here, the world that we're actually in, that things do often seem to work that way. Tia says, by the way, since the Brothers Karamazov predates Ursula Le Guin's short story, I wonder if she was partly inspired by Dostoevsky, or if perhaps they were both inspired by something else. Ooh, could be. I'm not familiar enough with Dostoevsky to say for sure, but I'm sure she read Dostoevsky, so it could very well be the case that she was, or that they were both inspired by something else. And then Yoavko says, anyhow, I have to leave. Goodbye, good night. Okay, thanks for stopping by, Yoavko. It was nice having you in the stream. So what I meant by intuitions is basically seemings, though even those have many definitions. Okay, so it sounds like we have broadly similar views of what intuitions are, though. Of course, one, I guess, could, as you say, sort of interrogate a little further on just what the nature of these seemings is. Tia says, you described what I was thinking via finding a system that accommodates these scattered intuitions. I personally find that satisfying, and isn't it worth it if you discover a new system? I'd like to think so, yeah. This is what John Rawls called reflective equilibrium. It's when you have a bunch of intuitions and you try to sort of make them all compatible, find a system that accommodates them all, or accommodates, as many of them as you can. And then you reach sort of reflective equilibrium from that process. Turkey Tipper says, TF, I swear I read somewhere that Omelas was inspired by Dostoevsky, but all that comes up is a Reddit post just claiming that. Oh, well, it must be true. Or it could be true. So, certainly appeals to my confirmation bias. Thanks for the input. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that it's true. I think it's a really cool thing when authors can be inspired by others' work in that way. Helps to know that your being's cosplay of sufferers for understanding rather than just entertainment. Still, per something you said earlier, I'm not committing to a description of my own ideal universe. For the moment, I would lean toward one in which voluntary struggles are still possible, rather than just imagined struggles. Okay, yeah, interesting note. I'm wondering what some of the voluntary struggles might be like. Because I would like to say that in the world I'm imagining too, maybe if a being really wants to struggle with something in real life, that they could. Like, what kind of struggle would it be? Maybe it would be a struggle to, you know, create beautiful art, or maybe that's not the kind of struggle. Maybe it's a, maybe the struggle would have to involve more suffering than that to earn the label of struggle. If so, then yeah, it's difficult for me to say for sure whether there would be room for those struggles in the world I was describing. Teradito, it doesn't say they do it for fun, but it is voluntary. That's right, yeah. Sounds like the world allows people who will for it and those who don't will for the experience. Bit fun. My biggest hang-up is the empathy. Okay. Yeah, if you'd like to, I don't know if exactly why that's a hang-up, but if you'd like to say more Teradito, let me know, because I would be curious to understand your view better. Ice Cube says, then could I ask what is your views on perfection? Who would be the perfect woman? What's the perfect flower? T-erected to your mechanical one-note world. It's not simply hard, it's impossible to have. Well, so my view on perfection, if that question is for me, Blue Ice Cubes, is that it's ultimately to be understood in terms of moral value. So, for example, the perfect world would be a world that has maximal moral value. So in the case of the other things you mentioned, though, like I suppose you could say those have their own criteria. Like the perfect flower, perhaps the criteria there would involve something like beauty, like beautiful as a flower. And I don't really know if there's a perfect flower, if there could be a perfect flower. Maybe there are just many different ways of being a beautiful flower or a good flower that, and ultimately, like past a certain level, none of the ways are better or worse than each other. It's just like there's, hey, you could like be like beautiful like orange flower or a beautiful blue flower or a beautiful purple flower, and none of these are better or worse than any other. Similar maybe for you know, perfect woman. I'm not sure if I would even I can think of like perfect person. Yeah, perfect woman. Would perfect woman just be like a perfect person who happens to be a woman? Or is being a woman something that is understood to have its own criteria here? Because that's a question that I think would also divide certain people. But so I don't know if I can give a comprehensive answer to your question, Blue Ice Cubes, but at least when we're considering worlds, it seems to me like the moral value in the world and trying to maximize that moral value is what I would be in favor of. So I like your comment, Tia's. Seeking suffering is a learned trauma response. I'm in this picture and I don't like it. Oh no. Complete ideals as humans, even to seek betterment, there's a point where you have to ask what objectively is better. Okay. Yeah, it's I do think that's a question each of us faces, is what objectively is better. And these are questions where it seems to me that when we disagree on which state of affairs is better, there is at least sometimes a fact of the matter. Like it's not just a matter of clashing preferences. So that, of course, gets into a big debate in meta-ethics in its own right. But yeah, I'm inclined to think there are objective answers to these questions. Turkey Tipper says, struggle seems to be somewhat necessary for meaning, at least how humans are built. A world where all information is given becomes a kind of library of Babel. From Jorge Borges, all the information means none of it is meaningful. Yeah, Turkey Tipper is dropping peak right now. I don't know about that. I came in late and jumped right into debate mode. Well, hey, jumping right into debate mode, that is perfectly fine, Turkey Tipper. But Yeah, there's actually, it's funny when you say Turkey Tipper, struggle seems to be somewhat necessary for meaning, at least how humans are built. There's an episode of Star Trek that goes into this. And I'm not sure if I remember exactly which one it is, but it's from the original series, so involving Captain Kirk. And he gives this big inspiring speech about how humans must struggle. Oh, I know what it is. It's the one called This Side of Paradise. So I'll type the name in the chat there if anyone wants to follow up on that. Kirk gives a little speech about how struggle is part of what is necessary for humans to make meaning. But I'm not sure if I agree with this part. Yeah, all the information is given becomes a kind of library of Babel. Jorge Borges, so all the information means none of it is meaningful. I mean, I agree that the Library of Babel, as presented in that short story by Borges, is one where the information ceases to be meaningful, just because like every possible book is there, and the vast majority of the books are just filled with random characters. They don't have any words or coherent sentences. But I like to think that in the ideal world I was imagining, even though we might stipulate, like, you know, every possible story, like, or every story worth being told is present in that world, there wouldn't be any of the filler. Which is basically what the Library of Babel consists of almost entirely. Like, all the stories in the world I'm imagining would be good stories, you know, stories worth engaging with. I like to think maybe that's sort of the key difference there. And you might not have been denying that. Maybe I'm reading too much in your comment. But if somebody were to press that as a challenge to me of like, hey, doesn't the world you're imagining have this problematic parallel to the Library of Babel? That's what I would say there. Learning to play Dark Souls, that's a voluntary struggle. Okay. Yeah, Robo, that's a good one. That certain modes of playing video games, like difficult games or rage games, do involve like a certain sense of struggle. Yet people take them on, you know, or at least some game. Maybe it's a special kind of gamer, but nevertheless, some gamers, including myself, take on challenges like that. So that is a good example. Blue Ice Cube says learning to play Dark Souls is like strapping yourself into the electric chair. Dramatic way of putting it, but I like it. I'm always in favor of dramatic formulations. But yeah, I think mastering a skill in art or athletics counts. Okay. Yeah, athletics, I didn't think of athletics, but that's a good example too. How that might involve certain kinds of struggle, like if one is training really hard. Blue Ice Cube says, I'm stupid in every area but emotional. Debates really aren't in my skill set. Well, Blue Ice Cubes, I would like to encourage you to maybe not think of yourself in that way, because it doesn't seem to me that you're someone who is, as you put it, stupid in every area but emotional. I think that you've left some very nice comments, some very good comments in this discussion, and it seems to me that you're being too hard on yourself. So I hope that in the future you will come to see that, in fact, you have many good qualities, including in the intellectual, philosophical sphere. I feel like the recurring vibe of Axe's philosophy streams is him espousing a view that's perfectly logical, but only according to his own values, which are so far removed from those of the average person that the rest of us are looking at him thinking, bro, the fuck? Oh no. Yeah, I mean, I've been told that before, that like one of my professors in grad school once told me that I had very strange intuitions. And perhaps this makes my views a bit less likely to be embraced by the average person, or at least in order to argue for the views, I have to do a bit more work to sort of connect them with other, you know, people's ways of thinking, and to find premises that are going to be plausible, you know, even to people who might think differently about the conclusions that I arrive at. Turkey Tipper says, I'll give a watch. Only ever seen that one Android episode. Oh, yes, that one Android episode. Oh, if you're referring to Data, perhaps. I think I know which episode you're talking about. This would be considered a burn on young Sheldon. I hadn't thought of that comparison either, but yeah, I suppose it would. In other words, y'all now know what I've been dealing with since August 2nd, 2025. For anyone who doesn't know, that was my debut date. Mm-hmm. That fateful day when philosophy VTubing changed forever. I'm thinking in a way that all information being immediately dumped in our heads means 90% of it is a kind of filler that gives us no meaning in life. It would almost dilute the kind of facts about the world that does give us meaning. Okay, yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, Turkey Tipper, because it brings up an important clarification, which I probably should have mentioned earlier. But yeah, I suppose we could say that there's something undesirable, or there would be something undesirable about simply having like all of the information be immediately dumped in our heads. Maybe it's worthwhile to experience the stories in a different way, to like choose to read them oneself and to kind of struggle with them one by one. So I guess, yeah, the way I'm imagining it is maybe there might just be like a bunch of books in this world, but like the people still have to go through and read them, or like a bunch of films they could watch. But like it's not automatic. The information from those stories is not automatically just dumped in their head. Like they still have to kind of engage with it, but they still choose to do so because they recognize that it's valuable. I realized that was not something I said earlier, or was very clear about earlier. But yeah, in response to that worry, I suppose that is a stipulation I would add about the kind of world I'm imagining. Makes you a fun VTuber to watch, though. Oh, thanks, Blue Ice Cubes. Well, you're a fun commenter to have in the chat. So I'm glad to know that you find the streams fun to watch. Terraditto, most Axaeon streams end with my brain. It just started to rain. It's over for my ability to think. Yeah, that's what philosophy does, you know. And it does it to me too. Sometimes I'll start reading or thinking about something, and by the end I'll just be like, ugh, okay, time to take a break from this for a while and like let my brain recharge. And I think that the fact that you find yourself feeling that way, Terraditto, is I think good evidence for the fact that you are someone who approaches these problems seriously and really does engage with them. I would say if you leave a like reading or thinking session or discussion session without feeling that way at all, I usually take that as evidence that a person has not really bothered to do the effort of thinking very deeply about these problems. Also, this is belated, but I think the idea behind Lackey's joke earlier is he's waiting for the game to start since he assumes the philosophy would go over his head. Oh! How did I miss that? You know, Tia, that is such a good interpretation, and Lackey, I don't know if you're still here, but if so, that is a good joke, and I'm sorry I did not see it earlier, but now I get it. And yes, that is quite funny. It would be funny, actually, if one day, like, I start a philosophy stream, but then just suddenly start playing a game, like, midway through it. Might have to add that to the list of ideas for future streams, now that I think about it. Turkey Tips is the classic one where he's on trial. There's just too much Star Trek. Oh, okay, I see. So, yeah, still in the original series. I know which one you're talking about now. The one where, yeah, he's on trial and, like, the computer is now controlling the ship. 2 minutes in, my brain was already on fire from my 2 brain cells panicking. Oh no. Yeah, the brain on fire image, that is something that I think could be really cool. And if I had artistic skills, I might try to draw a picture of that. But I think there's a lot of potential there for drawing what a very stylized picture of a philosophical engagement might look like. And it does involve someone's brain being on fire. Yeah, I love that image. It is fun. Sure, if Act were normal, he'd probably have a girlfriend, but it's a lot more believable that he's an alien, like in his lore in this way. He's like the wholesomest mad scientist ever. Okay, well, I'm glad it makes my lore more believable. Yes, because, of course, the most important thing about being a VTuber is that you have lore that goes along well with your streams. Not sure if that's actually the most important. It's probably not, but but any chance I can take to advance the lore of my character is something I will treasure. My brain's so mush, I just realized I didn't finish the sentence in my last message. Oh, it's okay, Terraditto. It happens to the best of us. Yeah, I think I was able to piece together the gist of it. So no worries on that. Someone get this man a piece of paper and pencil. Yeah. Not sure if you would want to see the upshot of But maybe in a future stream, that this might be an idea I have to return to. Of like representing philosophical engagement artistically. Axaeon finds his artistic skill. Wouldn't that be something? I mean, I do like drawing things on the whiteboard and, you know, making little, just really basic drawings of thought experiments. So perhaps this could be in that vein. But anyway, chat, I believe now is a good time to start thinking about ending the stream. We've covered quite a bit of ground in the stream. And not just from the initial reading, but primarily through all the comments that people have offered about questions of whether it makes sense to think of a perfect world. Like, is a perfect world possible? If one is possible, does it involve the kinds of provisions, stipulations that I was imagining? Particularly those that have to do with people's imaginative engagement with stories, and whether or to what extent struggle would still be part of a perfect world. And I will fully admit that those are questions I do not feel as if I have a perfect answer to yet, or a certain answer to. All I can give is just my own sort of best attempt so far at providing an answer to them. So these are questions that I think each of us has to ultimately work out for themselves. But I hope that the discussion was helpful in terms of thinking about these things. I know that your comments were certainly helpful to me in terms of helping to develop my own thinking on them. Is it better to raise all human consciousness to this perfect world or start fresh? Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, like if I could, so if the choice were between just making a completely new perfect world or taking the existing world and just sort of building everyone up to it. I kind of like the second possibility a bit more, of taking the world that we have and improving people's consciousness or improving people's abilities, and while also adding a bunch of, you know, new people, new sentient beings. I think if I were suddenly given omnipotence, I think that's what I would do. Because if the alternative is to somehow like just suddenly do away with this world, then the thought of of killing everyone in this world is something that I think I would not be very inclined to. I would want to keep the people of this world. I hope we all become blue when we start fresh. Oh, okay. Well, it's an intro. Oh, because blue ice cubes. I get it. Okay, you like the color blue. Yeah, I had not thought of this in terms of colors too much, but yeah, there are definitely, there would be blue things in the world I'm imagining. So you could enjoy those blue things, place cubes. I don't know if I would make everyone blue. That might be a little too much, but whoever wanted to be blue could be blue. I'll save my more deranged questions for next time then. I know I got here late. Dang it. Yeah, no worries on that, Robo. Also, if at any point you think of questions that you would like me to address on stream, always feel free to leave them as like comments on the VOD, and I will consider addressing them in a future stream. That's always an option. Thanks for the stream. It was especially fun having everyone here. Good night, Ax. Oh, thank you, Tia. It was fun having you here as well. And good night to you. A little scary, though. Something about the nature of human consciousness is a bit concerning. It is in its current form, but I think if it were sort of improved to a level or to a point where it was no longer concerning, to me that would be such a beautiful story. And I know I mentioned earlier the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, but in a way that's what I see that film being about, is sort of improving human consciousness to that next level. So if that's a film, if you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it. At least if you're the type of person who likes sci-fi. Glad I came for more than the gaming streams. Good night. Well, thanks, Blaze Cubes. Yeah, it was fun having you here. Also, just as a final note, for anyone who would be interested in seeing some of this week's later streams, on Wednesday, I'll be doing a social skills stream. So a bit out of the ordinary for my usual streams. But I figure, hey, I'm going, might as well go into social skills and like dive into, okay, like how does one be a socially skilled person? So that is going to be my lecture/discussion stream on Wednesday. And then on Friday, we'll be doing some more Minds Beneath Us. So back to the sci-fi gaming. Hope everyone won't have forgotten the story by then, but don't worry if you have, I will start with a recap. So on Friday, maybe Saturday too, if the game ends up taking that long, I might do a guerrilla stream on Saturday. But anyway, the schedule is posted on my channel and X, so you can always see the schedule there. All right, thanks everyone. Terraditto, was a nice stream. Oh, thank you, Terraditto. Yeah, thank you. I hope you all have a nice rest of the evening. I will... Oh, Turkey Tip says, have you played Soma? That would be a fun one. I have played Soma, yep. That before becoming a VTuber, I am so I'm familiar with Soma. I'm not sure, and it's a little unfortunate that I have, because I think it would be really fun to play that on stream if it were my first time playing it. Given that I have played it, I don't know if it would be as fun to play, because like I wouldn't have the sense of people being surprised by my reactions or me being surprised by the game. I will, though, try to get Karis to play it, or I think that would be a very fun to see Karis play this game. So maybe I'll have to see if I can motivate Karis to play it at some point. I know his viewers have been demanding it too. So we'll have to see on that one. Great stream. Thanks, Bobo. Yeah, thanks everybody. I will see you all next time. But in the meantime, rest well, stay warm, and good night.